You may have seen the title of this one and thought, oh, he's going to talk about the Herschel Walker trade. And I am. But there's so much more that went into it beforehand. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. I appreciate my hashtag everydayers so very much. Today's episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Today on the show, we're continuing with this series of sort of historical anecdotes and little notes and stuff. Some of it is sort of a dump of extra research that didn't make it into the history documentary series that I made a couple of years ago. Some of it is directly from there. It's at patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL if you're interested in 7 hours of Minnesota Vikings history content, everything from the inception of of football in Minnesota back in, World War I era, all the way up through the end of the Mike Zimmer era. Over 7 episodes of a documentary series. You can go check that out at patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. Today, we're going kind of decade by decade here. So today we're going to talk about the 80s. And you can't talk about the 80s without talking about Mike Lynn. This is going to be an episode that is largely about Mike Lynn and the bad decisions that Mike Lynn made. At least they were bad for the Vikings. Some of them were good for him, but they were bad for the Vikings. That includes some of the stuff surrounding the creation of the Metrodome and the era of change that it ushered in, the handling of a couple of different strikes in the 80s and how the Vikings sort of fell behind competitively during those times, not to mention being disrespectful of the strikes in general. And yes, the Herschel Walker trade. We'll get to it and some of these sort of unsaid things about the Herschel Walker trade and why it happened that sort of became Mike Lynn's legacy. But honestly, we're lucky that more damage wasn't done. But first, you got to know. So Mike Lynn was a movie theater mogul. That was his sort of claim to money, his path to money before he became the protege of Max Winter. And people who worked with him in the movie theater business knew that he always wanted to be a part of the business end of a football team. He wanted to be in that industry. That was a dream of his. So it was really exciting for him when Max Winter, the founder and owner of the Minnesota Vikings all the way up till 1985, more on that later, sort of took him under his wing. And the two were very close. It was very much like a right-hand man situation. Thing one and thing two, they were, he was the protege and I think seen as the successor to Max Winter. So it made the whole Metrodome thing all the more contentious. There are 2 main sources for this Metrodome stuff that it's only really been reported on once in any sort of true journalistic fashion, and then a whole bunch of aggregations of that. But it's a Brian Murphy article from over 10 years ago at the Pioneer Press. And then the other reporting that I've seen on this whole thing is from this book, Uncovering the Dome, by Amy Klobuchar, of all people, who is telling the story. A lot of this is telling the story from information she got from her father, Jim Klobuchar, who older Minnesotans may recognize his name from countless bylines in the Star Tribune as a sports reporter. But in it are a few interesting nuggets that I think really describe the mindset of Mike Lynn from one set to the other. So as this book tells the story, the Vikings needed a new stadium, and that had sort of been part of the fight was just getting that, right? Was just getting some sort of momentum to get away from Metropolitan Stadium, which by the late 70s, it was like decrepit. It was falling apart. And it was either we were going to expand the Metropolitan Stadium or we were going to knock it down and rebuild something. And if we were going to knock it down and rebuild something, we could either do another open air stadium in Bloomington, and which is where the Mall of America is now. This is those grounds, and the actual start of the Mall of America is an interesting story in and of itself that's in the history doc, where they took the land, they bought the old decaying Metropolitan Stadium because nobody bothered to knock it down. It just kind of started to decay. And so this like old haunted thing that gets bought up. And if you go to Camp Snoopy, I'm not going to call it by anything but Camp Snoopy, okay? If you go to Camp Snoopy, you can still find the like original home plate and the original 50-yard line. Anyways, where things really split was, are we going to stay in Bloomington or are we going to go to downtown Minneapolis and be like a true team of the city like so many other NFL teams are? And that's where things got contentious because Max Winter wanted a domed stadium and he wanted to go to Minneapolis. And it quickly became that like everybody who wanted a domed stadium also wanted to go to Minneapolis, and everybody who wanted to stay outdoors wanted to stay in Bloomington. Like it kind of divided very clearly along, I don't want to say party lines because this wasn't partisan, but along these sort of like this was the partition, right? And while Max Winter wanted a domed stadium, Mike Lynn wanted to stay in Bloomington and stay outdoors. And he made and because he was the public face of this, he was able to lobby a lot of support, and he made some points that turned out to be kind of prescient. He said that playing indoors would reduce the Vikings' competitive edge and pointed out that in 50 years, only two teams to that point had lost all of their home games, and they were Seattle and New Orleans, both of whom played in domes. They were essentially identifying that like part of what made the Vikings great, the Purple People Eaters and all of that, was the fact that like when the Los Angeles Rams had to get out of the California sun and come play up in the winter, they couldn't win. And that was like a thing in the 70s. The Rams could not win in the Met in December in the playoffs. Like they couldn't do it. And that, like, we still see that, right? We saw that last year with Miami going up to Lambeau and freezing their butts off in the cold and getting blown out. So that was like a big point with Lynn, but he eventually would switch sides. And this is where bad things start happening to the Vikings. So I don't know what conversation happened behind closed doors, but we do have quotes from everybody. And according to the Brian Murphy Pioneer Press article, it was like a sweetheart deal that Max Winter gave to Mike Lynn officially under the guise, I shouldn't say guise, under the justification of thank you for helping facilitate the construction of the Metrodome. As your reward, here is a contract with a stipulation that you get 10% of all luxury suite revenue. So Mike Lynn, like personally, just always got 10% of the luxury suite revenue for any Metrodome event, Twins games, Vikings games, concerts, whatever was going to happen at the Dome, the Super Bowl that one year, anything. If you bought a luxury suite, 10% of that money went right into Mike Lynn's pocket. Well, after he had departed from the Vikings, this was still true. If he died, this would remain true, which did happen. He did pass before 2013 and the Metrodome going down. The only way out of this ironclad thing was for the Metrodome to come down and a new stadium to be built, and then the contract would be null. So for a good 30 years, Mike Lynn took that money. Financial stuff is going to be a huge part of this story, and we'll get more into that when we talk about the 90s, but know that like this was a major drain on the finances of the Minnesota Vikings, and the finances of the Minnesota Vikings would have real impacts on what would happen later in the history of the franchise. This sweetheart deal sucked for the team, and it hurt the team, and it was sold as a reward for Mike Lynn. But my theory, based on the way that he talks here, he was pretty passionately arguing for Bloomington in this book. It happens on November 22nd, 1978. And all this arguing had happened, and like the debate had been basically said and resaid, and everybody was pretty much had heard out both sides, and we were ready to vote. But then suddenly Mike Lynn came out with a new idea. And the message was no dome, no Super Bowl. There were two reasons he said for this. One, that it would hurt players wanting to come to Minnesota. If they had to play in the cold, they're going to be more willing to come to Minnesota if they know they can play indoors. Probably turned out true. And then the second one is that the lack of cover meant that they would have to go elsewhere to practice. And in the playoffs, that would mean going elsewhere for the holiday season, and players would be upset about that. Sort of an old-fashioned thing, but that was how things worked at the time. Obviously, the schedule today, nobody's going to be home for any holidays. We're all planning on Thanksgiving and Christmas now. So we didn't foresee that. But the idea was that you weren't going to be able to win the Super Bowl unless you played in a dome. This is kind of a funny thing to me now as we see the outdoors, the Lambeau Fields and the Foxborough stadiums as this huge advantage in January and playoff season, and playing in a dome. These dome teams are a little less serious. And we wouldn't really find out a lot about that. But Mike Lynn switching sides happened and really surprised a lot of people. And then suddenly he gets this sweetheart deal at the end. So if I may speculate, and I am speculating, my speculation is I don't know how much Mike Lynn really meant it that he was fighting against Bloomington. I think he picked the side opposite of the people with the most leverage and money over the situation. And then at the last minute, he held their feet to the fire and said, give me something real good, and I will bring myself and my coalition of other stakeholders to your side, and we'll get this deal done. And he did. And he parlayed it into a wonderful luxury suite deal that would hold the Vikings hostage for decades. That would eventually maybe lead to the Vikings almost moving, arguably do more damage, but it's far from the only thing that that Mike Lynn did to the Minnesota Vikings. That'll be next on Locked On Vikings. Today's episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. At FanDuel, you can find anything you're looking for to bet on the upcoming Vikings season, from yardage totals, playoff props, and division odds, anything. For example, if you wanted, you could bet right now on the Vikings -106 to make the playoffs. That basically means that the betting market has no idea if the Vikings are going to make the playoffs or not. Their win total is set at 8.5 as well. People don't really know what's going to happen with the Vikings. However, over 8.5 wins is getting hammered. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. So go find some heavy favorite baseball game or something with super short odds. And if you win, you can get 30-1 on that super likely bet. Otherwise, you can find whatever you feel good about. Put $5 on it, and if you win, $150 in bonus bets. That is at nowhere else but FanDuel. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Moving on with the Locked On Vikings podcast here. A quick aside and maybe a preview for the next one. When we talk about the 90s and the Minnesota Vikings, their financial situation is going to lead to a lot of relocation talk. More relocation talk than there was during the stadium debate in full, which there was relocation talk. Max Winter actually met with the owners of the Los Angeles Coliseum, because at around the same time the Rams were leaving to St. Louis and leaving Los Angeles, and they were like, hey, what if we played there in the Coliseum, which was still seen as a very nice place then, by the way. It was very like state of the art, right? And that was a little more of a consult than like a, hey, let's feel out if Los Angeles would take the Vikings. But it had the effect it was supposed to have, where it put a lot of pressure on the situation. But in the late 90s, when money was really, really, really dry and Max Winter was out of the picture, the idea of relocating was discussed a lot more than was reported on at the time. We'll get to it later, but I want to mention that. What I want to talk about next is the strikes of the 80s. The 80s in the NFL were defined by labor issues. The strike of 1982 and the strike of 1987, both players' strikes. In 1982, the players striked to get a new I don't know if it's past tense the same way when you mean it into not like a baseball. Anyways, the issue was, it was a CBA thing, right? And I don't need to get into like what they were fighting over or anything like that, but understand that if you weren't around in 1982, like, you're me or younger, or less than a decade older than me, you need to understand that this crippled the NFL, this strike. They missed 8 games that year. And they had this weird expanded playoff format because everybody was, I think they only played nine games. So they missed 7 games. They missed half the season. And so they had all these like 5-4 teams in a weird wild card round and stuff. And that was awkward, but fine. The problem was they missed 7 games of revenue, and it was this devastating thing to everyone's bottom line. Owners hated that. And so when they did come to an agreement to get the players back in, it was short term. It was only a 5-year CBA. Now they go on this cadence of one every decade, right? And I would guess that the NFLPA and the NFL and owners and stuff are already doing research and coming up with ideas for what they want to change about the CBA when it comes to 2030. I would bet they're already having those conversations. This is a long-term thing. So to do this for 5 years, it's a little bit of just it's a bit of a snooze button. It's just kind of, okay, let's get out of this situation and we'll revisit this in 5 years when we have a little more time to get our feet under us, and maybe we can come to a better deal if we buy ourselves some time. But that time expired, and it led to the strike of 1987, which I would argue was much more famous. It was more violent. It was more contentious. And a big part of that was that the league did not shut down. This was the big, the big like resolution that the NFL had was, if they're going to strike again, we are not going to cancel games this time. Last time we canceled 7 games, we lost a bunch of money. We ain't going to do that. We are going to cobble together teams with whoever. We do not care if they're bad. We don't care if this is NFL talent or not. There's plenty of people that want to play football. We're going to give everybody a chance. We're going to sell it as, as underdog stories or whatever. And we are going to fully embrace this gab. And that's what happened in the middle of the 1987 season, where the Vikings were actually doing pretty good. The league goes on strike. All players leave. The only people who were allowed to go back into the facility by the players themselves were players who had injuries and specifically needed that medical attention. They went back into their facilities with the blessing of their teammates. The rest of them, for the Vikings at least, would still practice on their own at Normandale Community College. They would go throw the ball around, stay in shape, because you never know when you're going to have to go back. And otherwise, they were just trying to wait out the league. The way the Vikings handled this strike depends on who you're talking about, but for the most part, the Vikings were one of the more unified franchises in favor of the strike. The players themselves, nobody wanted to cross. They were one of just a couple of teams that had nobody but their injured players that they were okay with. Nobody else crossed the picket line. Many teams had like half their players went and the other half stayed. Some teams had players that that left and missed like one game, but then they were like, I need money for my kid or my, surgery or whatever. They needed to go back. And over time, there was like a slow trickle back in. Jerry Burns, head coach at the time, was as supportive as he could be, I guess. The coaches weren't really participating in this as a unit, so they didn't like join the strike or anything like that. They coached the new players, but Jerry Burns was fairly patient and did not like the Scabs at all. And there's, I guess, a solidarity in that. And then there's Mike Lynn. The thing about Mike Lynn and how he mishandled this strike, and why I'm bringing it up in the context of damage that he did to the franchise, is because Mike Lynn, as a GM, which was the job he very much held by this time, and by the way, Max Winter had sold his shares to Carl Pohlad, Twins fans, and Erwin Jacobs, and it pissed everybody off. There was more, I would say, behind-the-scenes drama between Mike Lynn and Max Winter. Their relationship was never really the same since this whole Metrodome betrayal thing. And Max Winter was very hurt by the whole thing, that Mike Lynn would take the other side and then leverage him and like do this whole thing. It was very Succession. And things were kind of never the same, and eventually Max Winter sold. That had allowed Mike Lynn and his coalition of money to get full team control of the Minnesota Vikings. And that meant that when the strike happened and everyone was scrambling to figure out what Scabs they could go find, Mike Lynn needed to lead that charge, but he very purposefully did not. He didn't believe that the strike was long for this world. He thought that the players would come back with their tail between their legs before the next game started. He thought this would last a couple days at most, and everyone would be back, and so he didn't bother to go for the scramble. There was a limited amount of available non-NFL talent. There were players from the recently defunct USFL that they could go get. There were just kind of your classic players who couldn't make a team, who now were, the best guy available, guys that were, cut from practice squads, guys that were cut during training camps or undrafted, players fresh out of college that couldn't get a job. And then maybe the best talent out there was the Montreal Alouettes that had just gone under in the Canadian League, totally separate story. And everyone was scrambling to find those players. And the Vikings stayed out of that scramble. And that meant that when it became real, and it became undeniable that the NFL was going to play a game and it was going to be played with scabs, the Vikings suddenly had to scramble. They had not long at all, just days, to put together an entire team. So they found the bottom of the barrel of what was left, and it was all awful, and they lost all 3 of these scab games by a ton. But maybe the funniest part of this, and I've told this story on this show before, but I have to tell it again, is what they did at quarterback. They ended up with a guy named Tommy Armstrong, who was 37 and long retired. And they managed to coax him out of retirement to play, and he was horrible. But they actually had one younger idea in mind, a guy on the coaching staff. There was a 36-year-old assistant that was like, I played in high school, put me in. And that guy's name was Pete Carroll. So Pete Carroll almost played quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings in 1987. They ended up going with Tommy Armstrong, but that was a pretty funny little anecdote that will sort of set the stage for both what happens a few years later with Pete Carroll and the Vikings, but also the sort of stunner that happened before with the Les Steckel year, which I should probably mention if I'm going to mention the 80s, which was, he was Bud Grant's successor. He was a successor that, by the way, Mike Lynn hand chose and liked a lot, and Bud Grant signed off on it, and he expresses in his autobiography his regrets over that, because he was like, he was young, he was not ready. We definitely rushed him into that. But Mike Lynn drove the Les Steckel thing. So if we're chalking up the list of sins, we've got this Metrodome thing that torched their finances. We've got this horrible Les Steckel thing that created the worst year in Minnesota Vikings history. And we have this strike debacle where they put together this terrible thing. They take 3 losses in a year where they were a contender, and they end up as a 6th seed. Now, because the Vikings were so unified, they ended up playing really well down the stretch, more so than the San Francisco 49ers. And this is the year where you have that Anthony Carter, 231 yards or whatever it was game, 227 or something like that, where he went into San Francisco and torched the 49ers, the Joe Montana, Jerry Rice Death Star at the height of its power. And the 49ers, and Joe Montana specifically, his desire to get back in and play games and start amassing wins during a Super Bowl window kind of was like a little bit of a dam breaker in terms of the union collapsing, and the players would very much lose in this strike, and they would lose this negotiation, in large part because a lot of players started to get antsy about their seasons, and Joe Montana wanted to play. He wanted to get back. He wanted to get his teammates who weren't, rolling in it. He wanted to get them back to work and get them their paychecks back. And when Joe Montana caved, it sent this huge signal that, like, the star of stars. I mean, he was Tom Brady before it was Tom Brady. The star of star quarterbacks is giving up on this. Maybe I should too. And it wasn't long before the whole thing collapsed and everyone was back. That's why, this like unified, peaceful Vikings going into San Francisco and beating Joe Montana, who kind of becomes a villain of the story, is so poetic. And obviously what happened in the NFC Championship game, they lose to Washington. Darren Nelson drops the ball. You could watch the history doc for that. But what I want to round this out with is what happened in the Herschel Walker trade and add one more sin to the list. That'll be next. I don't need to talk a lot about the Herschel Walker trade, okay? We don't need to go into a ton of detail. You know what happened, right? They traded a bunch of draft picks for Herschel Walker. It was terrible. All those draft picks turned into a dynasty for Dallas, and the Vikings fell apart. You know that. But what people don't talk about enough is how this happened. How come you thought it was a good idea to trade 3 first-round picks and 3 second-round picks for essentially Saquon Barkley of that time? The running back of the league. Off of a team that was very much in the tank, and didn't really have a lot of negotiating leverage because they were clearly selling the thing off for parts. A new owner had just come in Jerry Jones. He had hired a new coach, firing the very famous Tom Landry and bringing in this unknown guy named Jimmy Johnson. So it was this totally new thing with the blessing of the new owner and the longest leash in the world, basically saying, let's get rid of everything and start anew and amass draft picks and stuff. And the way, I don't know if this Cowboys tank works if it is not for Mike Lynn. The way this goes down is that the Vikings are in a bit of a panic after they get off to a sputtering start to the year. I think they're like 2-3. And they're looking at this roster and in particular Darren Nelson as not good enough. And so Mike Lynn actually first broaches the topic. He calls Dallas, and Dallas didn't expect that. Dallas was trying to get Herschel Walker traded to Cleveland for a huge bag of picks. And when Mike Lynn called, Jimmy Johnson, who was facilitating all this, went, oh, cool. I can tell Cleveland that I got another call. I can maybe up the price here. So let me give Minnesota this crazy trade deal that I kind of just need to be on the table at all so I can use it as leverage, but I don't really care about. So he comes up with this ridiculously convoluted thing. And like the convoluted nature of it is very on purpose because he is trying to confuse Mike Lynn. This is where it gets really embarrassing because he tells Mike Lynn, this is the deal. Take it by 6 p.m. tonight or leave it. So suddenly you don't have days to sit here and mull over and look at your charts and look at your, and consult. You have like hours to get through this whole really convoluted thing, understand it, and make a decision. In the rush, Mike Lynn, I don't think, fully understands what he is agreeing to. This has been my theory for a long time. Since making the history doc and really looking into this, my theory has been that Mike Lynn didn't think he was doing what he thought he was doing. I don't think he understood the trade, which is very embarrassing. I don't know if it's less or more embarrassing than agreeing to that, but as it worked, he treats it, and so does the media, by the way, treats it like they're trading these 5 sort of mid-tier starters. It's, kind of some, not quite Josh Olivers, but it's like a bunch of like Harrison Phillipses, right? They're these starters that aren't going to be the lifeblood of your team, but they're starters, right? And you're trading those guys, the loss of whom is not going to affect your team nearly as much as they thought. The addition of Saquon Barkley will, right? And it seemed like the Cowboys got totally fleeced and that the only superstar on their team is now there and they got all these like whoever's. Among those whoever's, by the way, is Darren Nelson, and Darren Nelson doesn't want to play for the Cowboys, and he's mad about the whole thing, and he demands a trade to San Diego and ends up being a Charger, and he'll actually return to the Vikings a couple years later. But the other provision is that there are conditional draft picks. This is the famous part, right? There's conditional draft picks attached to each player. So you get Jesse Solomon, one of the players, linebacker Jesse Solomon. If you cut Jesse Solomon after this season, if he doesn't play for you, let's say, if he doesn't start enough games and then you cut him next year, well, that will turn into a draft pick in 90 or 91 or whatever. And so what Jimmy Johnson did is said, well, I don't care that those guys are better. I don't really want these players. I want the picks attached to them. So I'm going to bench them. They're not going to start for me, which is the assumption that the Vikings made, was that those guys were at least going to play enough so that these conditions wouldn't hit. And really, I'm just trading players for this. And 1 or 2 of these picks might go through, and that's okay. They didn't expect Dallas to go for 100% just the picks. Cut all the players, and they don't return to Minnesota. Half of them are mad at you because you just traded them. And get all the picks from you. So it ends up turning into 3 first-rounders, 3 second-rounders, and in a panic, after Mike Lynn realizes what is going on, I think it's like the next day or a couple days later or something like that. Like shortly after the trade, Mike Lynn panics and realizes what's going on after he sees, after he sees that Jimmy Johnson's benching all the new players and goes, oh my God, he's going to cut them all. Oh, we're going to lose all these picks. And he calls Jimmy Johnson tail between his legs and says, can we renegotiate? Jimmy Johnson says, sure, I'll give you a couple more 3rd rounders just to get you off my back, basically. And they figured out this, and the pick we got for Darren Nelson and like a couple of these random things. So they ended up getting a couple of little tiny random picks, one of whom actually turns into Jake Reed, which is kind of funny. But it's this total panicked thing. So if we're itemizing the list of sins, Mike Lynn is the most damaging person to ever touch the Minnesota Vikings. He ruined their finances. He ruined their roster. He ruined the best season he presided over. And he ruined another season in the Les Steckel year just for icing on the cake. He is, to me, one of the worst things, maybe the worst thing to ever happen to the Minnesota Vikings. And the fact that he ended up on the side of playing indoors, I have always argued that Mike Lynn was right the first time, that playing inside ruined a competitive advantage that they had, and part of their struggle to truly be elite since they moved indoors. The best they have been is 1 year flash in the pan since then. No dynasties, no consistent contention, is because they lost that advantage. And if you add that cold advantage to these really, really, really good teams that we've had, who knows what could have happened. If you want somebody to blame for your Vikings pain, blame Mike Lynn. I'll see you all for the next one. And as always, Skol.